y'all, Dixie here. Today I want to talk to you about something I feel like doesn't get addressed a lot, which is backpacking in windy conditions and how you can manage it and not feel like you're Dorothy getting taken away to Oz. First, let's talk about when you're actually doing the hiking part of backpacking, like walking in the wind. Hanging in there like a hair in a biscuit. Definitely bring ear stuff. By ear stuff, I mean ear protection and then something like AirPods or whatever you prefer to listen to things. For ear protection, I would say something like earmuffs, a buff to wrap around your head, or even earplugs, which could act as ear protection and also blocking the noise of the wind. Because for me, the wind, especially if it's cold wind, really irritates my ears, like they start aching down on the inside. So having something to block the wind out is important for me, but also backpacking in the wind, especially for several days, can be maddening, just hearing that noise over and over and over. So having something like music or podcasts to listen to block out some of that noise can definitely be a mind saver. Secure your gear. If you've got anything hanging on the outside of your pack or something tucked into like the mesh pocket, make sure all of that stuff is in there really well because you don't want the wind carrying it off. Secure your hat. Normally I just take mine off and put it in my pack because I like backpacking with those wide-brimmed floppy hats, and it annoys me to no end to have the front flapping up and down and up and down in the wind, so I just pull it off. But if that doesn't bother you, or if you're hiking with like a baseball cap, you can anchor it to your head. Some people I've seen use a strap, and then some folks mentioned they put a buff around it. I assume putting also a beanie around it would do the trick, but just something to make sure that it sits there on your head pretty tightly because the wind will still it in a minute. Carry rain gear. Hopefully you're prepared for inclement weather anyway, but your rain gear like rain jacket and rain breeches can act as a windbreaker and give you an extra layer of warmth, especially if it's cold wind. Consider using eye protection, and this could be something even like sunglasses. But if you are backpacking in an area that's especially really exposed and like the desert where you've got a lot of dirt and dust flying up, and surprisingly, sometimes even if you're in the green tunnel areas, if you have enough wind and it's stirring things up, it can irritate your eyes. Don't forget your chapstick and skin moisturizer. Backpacking in the wind can dry you out quickly, so having a way to moisturize your lips and your skin can help prevent just being really uncomfortable. Because having chapped lips and then having to hike in the wind day after day as they're getting worse is just torturous. And the same thing with really itchy skin. Pack trekking poles. I know some folks prefer to just not use trekking poles, but if you know you're going somewhere windy and it's gonna be pretty intense wind, they can really help with stabilizing yourself. If you've got them anyway, then you're good to go, but I would definitely consider it if you typically don't and you know you're gonna be in intense wind. Pee with the wind. I feel like this one's pretty self-explanatory. Use the wind to your advantage for drying your gear. Most of the things that I've talked about regarding the wind are like negatives, but you could use the wind in your favor. I guess this is trying to find the silver lining of every cloud. But if you've been backpacking in rain or it's real humid, or sometimes you just get a lot of condensation on your tent wherever you're camped, during the night and in the morning. So using the wind on breaks, if it's a sunny, dry day, to kind of get everything really dried out well, can be useful. Now for the camping side of backpacking in the wind. First, I would say it's very important that you have your shelter easily accessible. You don't want to have to pull every single thing out of your pack and get to your shelter that's at the bottom, and then everything's blowing around and you're having to chase it down. So if you can have your shelter easily accessible, especially like on the outside of your pack, then you can throw it up, put your pack in there, and then unpack everything else. Have something weighted on hand when staking out your shelter. This could be a rock or even your pack with the rest of your stuff in it. But I think even if you've been hiking in the wind all day, sometimes it can still surprise you when you go to set your shelter up, because a lot of times we're on autopilot. You throw it out on the ground and whoo, a gust of wind comes and takes it away. So you want to throw it down if you're using a tent, put your pack or a rock in the middle of it, and then stake it out, and then remove that thing and finish setting it up. Set up camp behind a windbreak. There are natural windbreaks like the lay of the land if you can get kind of behind a hill, but I would obviously avoid a depression where things could get flooded out if it rains, but maybe even some brush or just different things that you can find out there. If you pay attention and you kind of squat down to the level of what your shelter will be, then you can see how much wind is going to be hitting you in different areas. Definitely with this one, avoid high points like ridges and peaks, because on a windy night that can just be absolutely miserable. Also, avoid camping near dead trees or widowmakers. I feel like I've talked about widowmakers a lot lately, but sometimes if you're hiking through a burn area, you'll have a lot of dead trees still standing or an area with beetle kill, and you definitely want to avoid camping in those areas because they're just waiting to fall over and the wind can help them, and you don't want to wake up with the tree falling on you. Next, orient your tent or shelter correctly. Just if you can, while you're setting it up, if it's blatantly obvious the direction that the wind is blowing from, then you want to set up the more narrow side of your shelter facing into the wind. That way you don't have the wind hitting the broad side of your tent or tarp or other shelter, because with that force, it can snatch up stakes and just give you a headache all night. Take along the proper shelter. I would say that the best tent that you could go for if you know you're going to be in windy conditions is a completely freestanding tent. So a tent that has its own set of poles, and it can set up with those poles, and like technically you don't need any stakes because it stands by itself. You don't have to stake out any pieces of it. That's not to say that you won't still put stakes in the corners, but it stands on its own. Then you have semi-freestanding tents that have a designated set of tent poles, but they also rely on stakes to be completely set up. So maybe this is staking out the rain fly or making sure that the sides are staked out and taut or whatever. And then finally, you have tents that heavily rely on stakes and also like your trekking poles, so they don't have tent poles. This is obviously going to be the least favorable when setting up in windy conditions, because the tent stakes, if you get a lot of force on the side of your tent, are easily snatched out of the ground. Another important factor is the tent shape. A tunnel tent or a dome tent will be much more aerodynamic than a trekking pole tent. With that said, I always use the worst choice as far as wind is concerned. I like taking tents that set up using trekking poles. So there are some things that you can do to mitigate issues like I've mentioned before with campsite selection, but also you can use large rocks to set on the tent stakes to help keep them in the ground so they're not getting snatched up during the night. And also I usually carry a couple of extra stakes, one in case I lose any, but two, so if I do have a windy night, I can stake out the extra guy lines. Most tents have these, even if it's a freestanding tent, just to help give you more security. But you can tie out these extra guy lines to things that are more rigid and aren't really gonna go anywhere, hopefully, like trees or bushes and other things nearby. It'll also help if you choose a tent with a zipper door and set up your tent walls as low as possible. The ultimate test was when I backpacked in Iceland in the freezing cold wind and rain, and that was absolute misery. I would not recommend it, but there are ways to mitigate this situation if you find yourself in it. Generally speaking, if you want to avoid the wind, it's better to avoid camping above tree line altogether. But if you know you're going to be camping a lot in an exposed area prone to extreme wind or above the tree line with no wind breaks, your best bet is to just go with the freestanding tunnel or dome tent. But if you do, make sure you have one with strong aluminum tent poles, because one thing worse than having a stake pulled out of the ground is having your entire tent snap and collapse on top of you. Finally, know when to just stay home. If you know there's a strong thunderstorm coming through, there kind of really are no good options. But if you can't below the tree line to avoid wind and lightning, there's of course a risk that one of those trees is going to fall down on you. If there are going to be tornado-like conditions, then it's probably best to not be out there and to reschedule your trip so you can actually continue to go on more backpacking trips because you don't get out there and die. Well, all right, y'all, that is all I have for you today on tips for backpacking in windy conditions. If you have any other tips and tricks that you have discovered helped you in windy conditions, please feel free to leave it in the comments below, because I'm always trying to make that experience better than the misery that it can be. Thank y'all so much for watching, and we will see y'all next time.